Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I hope wherever you are, you're all well and safe and healthy. I'm Maria Estorino, and I'm with the University Libraries at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to our presentation with Rachel Marie Crane Williams and her new book, Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, The Detroit Uprising of 1943. This talk is part of the Off the Shelf series, which is a co-production of the University Libraries and UNC Press. Our goal is to present works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and in our world. Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed is part of the Documentary Arts and Culture series published by the press in association with the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. And we're grateful to the center and also to UNC Chapel Hill's Arts Everywhere initiative for co-sponsoring this event. Professor Williams will be in conversation with my colleague, Josh Hockensmith. Josh is the library assistant at our Joseph C. Sloan Art Library, where he works with our collection of artist books and zines. He has a BA in English from the University of Richmond and is currently working on his MA in art history here at UNC with a focus on artist publication. Josh is interested in small press, indie, and self-publishing, and the history of artists who use publishing and the book as an expressive medium. He's also a very talented independent writer and book artist who has been producing small run artist books under the name Bluer Books since the late 1990s. So before we get to our program, I want to make two notes. One is that the event is being recorded, and the other is that the Q&A box is open for your questions, which we'll have time for at the end to moderate. And so thank you again for being here. And with that, I'm going to let Josh take it over from here. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you so much, Maria. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Off the Shelf program. As Maria said, I'm Josh Hockensmith, the library assistant at UNC's Sloan Art Library. And I'm excited to be talking today with Dr. Rachel Marie Crane Williams about her new book, Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, The Detroit Uprising of 1943. I'm going to do a brief introduction here, Rachel, and we'll get started on our conversation. So Professor Williams is an artist, researcher, and teacher originally from Eastern North Carolina. She has a BFA in painting and drawing from East Carolina University and both an MFA in studio art and a PhD in art education from Florida State University. She's an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she's been since 1999. And she teaches in both the School of Art and Art History and the Department of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, as well as serving as a university ombuds. Rather than try to summarize her work, I'm going to borrow liberally here from her faculty page on the University of Iowa website, which does a much better and more succinct job than I could do myself. So American alternative / single creator comics and graphic novels have been at the heart of Professor Williams's creative scholarship for the past few years. Her graphic scholarship has been published by the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, the Journal of Cultural Research and Art Education, and the International Journal of Comic Art. Her current projects include a graphic novel about the Detroit race riots of 1943, which is the book we're going to talk about today, a novella about the lynching of Mary Turner, which I think grew out of the research that she did for this book, a mini comic about police brutality, and The Prison Chronicles, a series of stories about her work in women's prisons. She recently completed 25 large-scale illustrations for the Guts and Glory exhibition about the Czechoslovak Legion during World War I for the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library. Professor Williams teaches courses about comics and sequential art, women's studies, intermedia, prison, feminist research methods, and civic engagement. So Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to join us. And I'm really excited to talk with you and learn more about your work.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And Maria, thank you for hosting us. And thank you to the UNC Chapel Hill Libraries. It's really an honor to be here today and to be your guest. And I'm so tickled to be interviewed by you, Josh, as a fellow artist and a person who appreciates books. So this is a really big deal. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Do you want to share your screen and your first PowerPoint slide,
Sure.
And we'll start off with prepared questions?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, let me blow that up. All right, great. So I don't know if you want to ask a question. One of the things I wanted to
Sure.
sort of share with you really are two kind of quotes that have really sustained me through the work I do as an artist, and also sustained sort of centering the subjects that I am interested in. So, the first one is Susie Gablick, who I absolutely love her writing and love what she writes about. And to some degree, that probably dates me a little bit. But one of my favorite quotes from her is, "Vision is not defined by the disembodied I, as we have been trained to believe. Vision is a social practice that is rooted in the whole being." And so in my mind, what she's asking us to think about is not only, as artists, what we see, but how our position influences, what we pay attention to, and how we're interconnected to other people. And that really brings me to my second quote, which is from an Indigenous artist, Lila Watson. "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And in my mind, as a feminist, that is one of the driving forces. Until everyone's free, I can't be free. So, that those are really important things in terms of the work that I do.
That's excellent. I love that Lila Watson quote too. And the idea of vision as a social practice is such a powerful one. And I feel like it's something that informs work in book forms like graphic novels, or because sharing books is a social practice, and the book is only completed when the reader is engaged. So you're always engaged in like a social interaction.
Yeah, it's always a conversation between you and your readers. And really that conversation shifts when readers share it with other readers, or read it in different spaces, or with different things in mind. I mean, I think everyone's sort of intersectional identities really, you know, decide what they pay attention to and what's important. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like publishing is also a big part of that, building different networks and tapping into different audiences and connecting with different readers. And so the fact that this is UNC Press's inaugural, graphic scholarship, book of graphic scholarship, means it's going to be reaching another audience and like getting into a different network of book consumption.
yeah, they were so fabulous to work with. I think the Duke Center for Documentary Studies and UNC Press are really, and have always been out on the edge in terms of the things that they, choose to share, and the energies, where they choose to direct their energies. It was an incredible pleasure and a real learning experience, for me. And, as a group, they were so patient. And honestly, the book was made so much better by, the editors there. Their vision really did a lot to help shape it. And, I'm not a historian, I'm an artist. And we'll talk a little bit later. I'm a huge fan of historians, like really like a geeky kind of fan. But I don't know how to do history, and so that was a real learning experience. And I think they really they played a pivotal role in that education.
Fantastic. Well, I have a question sort of about your work in general that maybe we can start with. So
Sure.
the main impression that I'd take away from your biography, your CV, all of your work, is just how interdisciplinary your work is. You're a faculty member in 2 different departments, as well as serving an important administrative role as an ombuds. Your work is based, like you've said, in both research and creative practice, historical subjects, as well as very, very contemporary current ones. So have you always worked across disciplines like that? And how does it kind of sit at the heart of a project like this book?
This is a great question. And I will say, I was very single-minded in my educational pursuits, as a young person. I mean, I loved painting and drawing. I wanted to be a studio artist. I had a lot of different interests. I'm a big reader, but I really knew that is where my passion lay. And then sort of in the middle of getting my MFA, I was really fortunate to have this experience where I volunteered to teach in a women's prison. And it really turned my head around in terms of like the liberatory power of education, and, what that meant. And so with that in mind, I ended up taking a class with Dr. Sally McRory, and she's played a huge role in my life as an academic throughout my entire sort of history. And I feel so lucky to have met her. And she's also from North Carolina. So I have to give a little tip to North Carolina. I took a class with her about art and philosophy and critical theory. And that really, for me, was this pivotal moment where I thought, I think I want to do more than just make paintings in my studio. And, I continued to do work in the community. I worked with a really amazing team of mural artists in Tallahassee and taught public school, and was an art teacher in the public schools. And that was also just probably one of the best experiences of my life. I mean, I'm still really nostalgic about being a K through 12 art teacher. And, sometimes I think, I should just go back to being a K through 12 art teacher. It was the best job ever. But, that really informed my trajectory in terms of what I ended up studying. And, it really, to me, opened this door about, what art can do. And, besides sort of fulfill our aesthetic sensibilities. And so when I did my dissertation, I worked at Tachita Correctional Institution up in Wisconsin to interview a number of women in that system who identified as artists. And in that work, I really, at that point, I'd probably been working in prison for about 4 years, and really began to look deeply at, the history of these institutions, mechanisms of punishment, systemic inequality, racism, all of those things really came to the forefront of my work. I understood it as a person growing up in the South, especially a person who grew up very middle class. I had a very clear understanding of the ways that race worked. But I had never thought about it in a bigger systemic historical way until that moment. And so, after that, I've always made work. I draw every day, and I continue to paint and draw, but I've really been fortunate enough to sort of broaden what it is I do. And my university is an amazing place to work, and they've honestly really let me follow my bliss. And art education is a huge field. People think of it as being K through 12 art teachers, but it's actually much broader than that. And so, and I've always primarily worked with women and girls, people who identify as women and girls. And, that really led me to the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. And I think my work in prisons made me think a lot about restorative and transformative practices related to justice, which led me to conflict, and really, in some ways, really informed my work as an ombudsperson. So, I've always sort of been interested in a lot of different things.
Yeah, that brings us back to the idea of interconnection from that first quote. Well, that's wonderful. Yeah. So if we zero in more on the book then, so what drew you to research the Detroit Uprising of 1943 in particular? How did you learn about it? And what was so compelling about it that it sustained your work on it for over 11 years? This is a long-term project.
Oh, it is, and in that time, I want to acknowledge, I was mothering, raising kids, trying to get tenure. A lot was going on. So I think, I think if I had been single-mindedly devoted to this, it probably would have passed much quicker. But I'm actually glad that it took me that long to do this. I think the book really benefited from that kind of incubation and that long-term attention. But I started out the first, I did a couple of different kinds of comic essays is sort of how I think about it. And the one that really took me to this was a piece I did for Southern Cultures, related to an artist named Norman Etheridge Jennett, who was really actually did a number of horrendous and sort of racial editorial cartoons in 1898 in North Carolina that really contributed to, what I think of as one of, a coup in Wilmington, a very bloody race-related coup. And in that experience, I worked closely with Tim Tyson and was deeply influenced by his work. And, it also opened my eyes to sort of the history of interracial violence and uprisings and rebellions throughout, North America. And I had lunch with a really good friend, Joe Parsons, who at the time he had played a part in bringing Tim Tyson to Iowa City to read at Prairie Lights. And we were eating lunch and he said, if you're really interested in, what history looks like in these instances, you should look at the 1943, at that point, riot in Detroit. And I said, what are you talking about? And I'd known about the 1967 rebellion. Like that story I knew that story vaguely, but I knew of it, but I'd never heard of what happened in 1943. And, the more I looked into it, the more interesting it became, I have to say. And, really for me, I was like, I'm going to go and visit Detroit. I want to see where this happened. And I was hooked. I mean, Detroit is probably one of the most amazing cities in the United States. And if I was, 25 years younger, that would be the place I would think about moving as an artist. I think so much is happening in Detroit. So.
Excellent. Do you want to say anything about the images that are on this particular slide?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, really this image over on this side where you have a young person, with their hand over their head, and you also have an image of the United States, sort of this mapping. When I started to look at what was happening in Detroit, I realized that this had happened all over the country in that same year, these kinds of disturbances. And many of them really, oppression and race was sort of at the heart of what was happening. And, it was really an ironic time because here we are, it's World War II, we're overseas, fighting for human rights. But in our own country, Jim Crow is really the law of the land. And, it was very, what a paradox that we're doing this one thing, but we're actually living in this other way. And, we're fighting against a regime that patterned themselves after the way we treated people in this country. And so, incredible irony. This other piece is based on the Eastwood Amusement Park. So even before the summer of 1943, there had been a number of moments sort of in the urban landscape when, police really took on surveilling certain areas. So especially areas where young Black folks had gotten together to just sort of recreate, hang out and be together. And so, the police and other folks were really invested in keeping those spaces white. So the Eastwood Amusement Park is a story sort of within that leading up to what happened that summer. And then, the other thing that was happening is whites were really fearful that, a piece of the pie was going to be taken and their pie would be smaller. And so they were seeing, competition in the areas of housing, in the areas of jobs, and really had not contended with that prior to that moment in a way that you see in this time.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I really appreciated about the book was setting the incident, setting the uprising in the context of like sort of the historical continuity of other events, both in Detroit and elsewhere in the US.
That was really important to me. I mean, the terminology around this is riot, but it really was not a riot. I mean, it wasn't out of the blue. A lot of things had built up to this moment. People were fighting for things that they really believed in. It wasn't, it wasn't unfocused, it wasn't meaningless. You know, it wasn't meaningless violence. It had been preceded by a number of incidents where people said, you know, I have to do this, or I'm going to lose my livelihood, I'm going to lose my life, and were really sucked in to situations that they did not intend to be part of.
Mhm. Could you talk a little bit more about the terminology? I know in your author's note you explained that difference between riot and uprising, and sort of like the purposefulness of what was happening.
Absolutely. You know, the thing that happened, what happened in Detroit is really a series of smaller stories, you know, and that's one of the things I hope I conveyed. So, you know, life is going on day to day as usual, you know, in June in 1943 in Detroit, but there's these small pockets, and small is relative, you know, within the city landscape where people are duking it out, you know, with blood and with guns and with, you know, clubs and knives, and really trying to make a space that they felt, you know, had been either taken or didn't exist. And so, you know, people were, I think, you know, if you think about what happened on Belle Isle, for example, which is where everything started, again, that space was incredibly limited. It was super hot. All kinds of people were on that island that day and really competing for space on that island and visibility. You know, this is a place we can be. And so you have working class whites, you've got working class Black families, you've got all kinds of folks. And so, and you also have young people, you know, they were at that point in time, they were pretty squirrely. You know, there's a lot going on, high anxiety, you know, there's a war going on overseas. What are we going to do for jobs? You know, what is life going to look like for us? And so, you know, that is a fight. You know, you have this big sort of brawl happening. And then beyond that, it changes, it shifts, because suddenly the violence is preceded by all of these rumors of what's happening. You know, so Black communities came out to sort of defend this idea that people within their community had been purposefully targeted and injured. So that's where the Mary Turner story sort of came to me. This rumor that a Black woman and her baby had been thrown off the Belle Isle Bridge is one of the things that really inflamed people, you know. And then on the other side, you know, you have white residents saying, well, this Navy, you know, soldier and his girlfriend were attacked. And of course, you can imagine that's the typical triad of a white man, a white woman, and a Black person, you know, which is so familiar to lynching narratives. So that, you know, that violence really changes. And then you have people that are fighting, you know, the streetcar is another sort of setting where there was a lot of fighting for really who can use this service, who can take up this space, who do I have to sit next to, who do I get to sit next to, and these are communal spaces. And then there were some other incidents. So, for example, the St. Antoine YMCA, there's a shooting of a young Black man there, and police harassment of a number of the residents there who were Black men as well. And that was just straight up police brutality. You know, these are folks minding their own business. This is an active social justice hotspot, so it makes sense that the police would target it. You know, there's another story on Verner Avenue where a series of apartments, there's a shooting. You see there's a white mob coming up the street, right? And they're coming to raise hell in this predominantly Black area. And you know, you can imagine if you looked out your window and you saw a mob of bloodthirsty people that you knew were coming to hurt you only because of your identity, it would be terrifying, especially given the history, you know, up until that point, which is long and bloody. So there's a policeman that's shot, and then all hell breaks loose. And the police release this incredible, brutal vengeance on people within that apartment. And, you know, I choose the story of Mathilde Fornes in particular. And, you know, the NAACP goes and collects all of these affidavits. And she's an older Black woman. She and a number of her friends are basically lined up outside the building. They stand there for hours. They're frisked, they're terrorized. And all the while, police are looting their apartments, you know. So that's not a riot. And so for people to define that in that way it really misses the complexity of what was happening. And I have to say, I had a great conversation with Carlos Hill, who's an amazing historian who really did a lot to shape my thinking on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the most chilling and powerful parts of the book for me, I believe, was the accounts of the victims of police brutality and bringing names to individual people. So John Lewis, the black soldier who is attacked in the street while he's in uniform.
Yeah.
And Susie Mae Robinson, who's brutalized while trying to help him. And
they come back, they come back to terrorize her more. They shoot at her house, here she is. I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, literally. She goes to help this young man. She works like crazy to flag down someone to pick up. I mean, this is a young black man in uniform, dressed to the nines to go to the movies, and he is just beaten, taken from behind, whacked in the head. She sees this. She leaves her house and goes to help him. I mean, actually at great peril to herself, because she's a black woman in Detroit, and a police person did this, and a policeman did this. And, she flags down mail carriers. And the history of postal service workers and blackness in the United States is fascinating. And that's a whole nother project. But they end up taking him to the hospital. And then she goes back, she's talking, and then the police come and spray her house with bullets. It's unthinkable, but it happens. And it's really not unthinkable if we think about the history of race and police brutality and violence in this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've kind of been getting around what was my framing for the next question that I was going to ask. And I think the question has already been answered, but I do want to say this about your book, that it does such a great job of conveying these nuances and complexities of the wartime situation for the individuals and the communities involved. But at the same time, it never loses its sort of like moral clarity and its focus on the wrongs that are being perpetrated and the forces of white supremacy at work. It's really sort of empathetic storytelling, but also very, very clear-sighted. I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So you've moved ahead a slide here. Do you want to comment on this image or?
Well, I mean, this image is interesting because for me, it really combines sort of my proclivities as like a painter, drawer, and also this on the edge. And I don't know if you can see it clearly, but there's a list. And these are people that were listed in the newspaper who were killed, during this period of time in Detroit. And what really struck me, and 34 people are killed, 25 are black, 9 are white, but this really hit for me. 17 black people are fatally shot by police. A number of people are injured. There's all this labor lost, lots of property damage, but no one's ever truly held accountable for this. The police certainly aren't. They actually play a role in the afterward trying to, the city appoints this riot commission, which is typical. And they say, well, it wasn't us. It was not us. We did what we needed to do. They never acknowledged, their role in what happened.
Yeah, your portrayal of the different authority figures is really interesting. So, Mayor, is it Mayor Jeffries, I believe, and the governor, and just sort of the layers of authority that fail to respond to this situation in an adequate way.
And they weren't, I don't want to vilify or villainize these people and make them out to be villains. They weren't. But they were indecisive. They kind of had their fingers in the wind to figure out, which way is the wind blowing? What should I do here? And they were really stuck, like a lot of white people were at that point in time, knowing morally what is happening is wrong. But, this is going to really change the balance of white power. And do I want to be the person to begin to tip those scales? What does that mean to do that kind of work? And they were part of, a violent system that, you can still see even now. If you look across the country right now at how municipalities are responding to incidents with police, to incidents where people are protesting. There are different responses, and people looking back don't always get it right, and I think really oftentimes one of the things that's hard is just sort of being in denial that this is going to happen. And really the mayor was kind of, I don't understand how, but really in denial that anything bad was going to happen. I think it was just fear and not having a clear idea of how to handle it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I see we've gone to a slide here on process. So I did have some questions for you about your artistic process. So the book is an example of graphic scholarship, which might be a term that's not familiar to folks, but serious research and scholarship that's presented through visual storytelling as well as textual. Can you talk about how you came to that practice? What do you like about working in graphic novel form?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are like, so did you grow up reading comic books? And I didn't. I'm kind of an outsider in terms of like comic studies, and students take my classes and they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about DC and Marvel. This is going to be amazing. And on the first day I break their hearts and I'm like, I actually don't know very much about that. I've watched the movies, and they always look at me like, horrible. But really for me, comics, what happened to me was I watched American Splendor, which is based on Harvey Pekar and his life. And I thought I had this, and this sounds so, looking back, I'm like, well, duh. But, I do ethnographic qualitative research. So I collect people's stories. I had this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I can illustrate people's stories instead of just writing these academic tomes, that God knows, will anyone ever read this? So that was this sort of moment for me. And I love to draw, just love to draw. And so the other thing about Detroit is the archives. So the NAACP, after everything, well, not even after, really, when things were beginning to cool off, I mean, they were immediate, collected affidavits from people and said, what happened here? And they did an amazing job of recording multiple people's accounts, of the violence across the city. And it's really interesting because it provides a sort of counter narrative to the work that a lot of sociologists and journalists did right after everything happened. So there's a series of writing and books that come out in 1944 about what happened. And, they're written by white men who are academics. And, these are liberal folks, they're trying to get to the root of things. They're not trying to uphold white supremacy, but they really miss a large, a large path of evidence. So when, if we go back to that first quote about Susie Gablick, and we talk about vision as an embodied social experience, their vision was so limited, and who they were interested in, what they were interested in, and who counted. And so in their accounts, you don't really see Black women. And Black women were a huge part of what happened in Detroit and what happened after, in terms of civil rights and making real changes. And so, the NAACP archives really made that present. And so just the stories, these are first person accounts, and they were filled with images. And then, if you go back, and a lot of the places that are mentioned in my book they don't exist anymore in Detroit, but I also was really lucky. The Detroit Free Press let me into their photo archives, and newspapers sadly are really transitioning to a very different kind of textual experience for readers. And so, it was this room with just file cabinets and a very wonderful woman who was sort of hanging out, kind of bored, and she said, here's where everything is. You can look at anything. I'll make copies. And so in this image, there's an image at the bottom there of, from the Detroit Free Press, and you can literally see where the photographer sort of marked it and cropped it. And so, that was super cool. And that really changed everything for me in terms of being able to see what did Detroit look like in 1943. So, it was the stories from the NAACP. I read all the letters in the Detroit Library written to the mayor, and that sort of began my drawing. And here you can see my notebook. And so what was hard for me to do is to write it out. Like, how do I make this work? What's history? What are real quotes? Where do I have to fill in the gaps with storytelling and images? And so that was sort of part of that process. And really, I'll come back to this. These are all the folks that influenced me. I would sort of sketch it out in my notebook and take notes. And then I would begin drawing. And all of this, for the most part, is hand drawn, with pencils and ink. And I kept it really simple so that I could just work anywhere, put it in my backpack, go sit at Prairie Lights, draw for an hour. If I'm hanging out waiting for the bus, I can sit and draw for an hour. And everything was 9 by 12 that I drew. It was the same kind of paper, the same size. And so it took me a while as an artist to quit working in single images and begin to think about panels and then spreads. And it would take me months to work on a chapter just because as a non-historian, it was hard to wrap my head around the whole story, and what was important to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things in the book is the effect that it has where you're working with archival documents, which we don't think of as being that graphically interesting. You said that when in your author's note, you say how when you're looking at the NAACP affidavits, they convinced you that there was a visual story to be told here. And I thought, how did that work where you're working in an archive and it's a visual experience? But I can really see from this example how that works. But one of the things I really love is when you reproduce documents, typewritten documents or things like that by hand drawing them, and it really like humanizes this documentary evidence and
I appreciate that you appreciate that. I'll tell you what the deal is, and this will tell you how much I hate paperwork. To get permission to use those documents was this process, and it would not have been difficult. I mean, the archives that I worked with are used to people making these requests. They're very kind, incredible. Like I also have a major soft spot for librarians and for archivists. Like I could never have done this, but it was honestly more pleasurable and easier for me to duplicate those documents than to go through the process of figuring out where I found them. How do I get permission for this? How do I get a good reproduction? I mean, that tells you something, doesn't it?
I think it's such a unique look to the book. It's fantastic. Yeah. So you mentioned briefly working in archives. You worked in a lot of different archives to do your research for this, different kinds of institutional archives.
Yeah, I'll show you. I have a slide that has all those folks, their places. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was that experience like? Was it different from place to place? And like, were there things missing from the archival record that you hoped to find?
For me, I think for me, it was sort of like, this is going to sound really funny, but when I first started to write my dissertation and sort of begin to think and write like a quote unquote real scholar, there was this kind of thrill, and the same feeling happened for me going to these archives. I was like, I can't believe that I can see an actual piece of paper from 1943 that might have been stapled on a telephone pole, or that I can see this postcard that, Susie May sent to the mayor to say, hey, you really made me angry, that I could actually hold that piece of paper in my hand and see where her pen had pressed into the paper and indented it. So I think the physicality of the archives was really thrilling for me. One of the other things that I love to do, I love thrift stores, and I love, any kind of experience like that where you sort of go and look at what's there. It's a treasure trove. And the archives were really like that for me. I mean, really the one that was the most, probably that I visited the most and that was the most useful was the at Wayne State University, the Reuther labor archives. Those were phenomenal. And I have to say the people that work there were equally phenomenal. And then this one with the beautiful images is at the Detroit Public Library, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world. It is so fabulous, and they have an incredible comics collection, but they also have a great archive. And so that's where the mayor's papers were. Then I went to Michigan, the University of Michigan, obviously. This is the the newspaper that gave me all of the photographs, and then the Charles Wright Museum, which is right across the way from the Wayne State Archives, another amazing place. So, I had lots of excuses to go to Detroit multiple times. And then, of course, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., I love those archives. And, I will find any excuse to go poke around there. And you just feel so special. You can find, it just blows my mind the things that you can find and read there.
Mhm.
So.
I think we had skipped over, you had a slide with your sort of colleagues who also do this kind of work. And
Yeah. So, as an academic, of course, I'm like, oh, now I'm interested in this. I will buy every book I can find, or check them out, read them, get my hands on them. And so there's a lot of folks that do sort of comics around different stories and storytelling, modes of storytelling. And so honestly, Joe Sacco is just my absolute hero when it comes to this. And I think he is one of the most amazing storytellers in terms of drawing and collecting sort of, really powerful and important stories. But, there's a lot of folks doing this kind of work. I mean, I have to say, Carlos's book, The Murder of Emmett Till, is amazing. So is Abina and The Important Men. And both of these are sort of historical, and they have links to archives and archival documents. But then, as far as drawing, I mean, a lot of folks really influenced, the way I thought about comics. Carol Tyler is one of my favorite artists. So obviously is Phoebe Glockner, and of course the Hernandez brothers. This book right here, oh my gosh, Special Exits is one of the best books you will ever read in your life, by Joyce Farmer. And it took her years to make that book. It's sort of about caring for her aging parents. It's beautiful. Obviously Jeff Lemire is another person. I love his drawing. This is Essex County. It's all black and white ink. And then, you've got people like Nate Powell, Alison Bechtel, who, I don't even know where to begin with her and her work. She's just a phenomenal person and a phenomenal artist and writer. And then, Emmanuel Guibert, who's a French artist, has done beautiful comics. And his work, I love his work because of the way he uses ink. And so, there was a lot of artists that really influenced me. There's also a lot of historians and scholars and writers. I have to say that, and I think Jim Daniels is a poet who writes a lot about Detroit, and his poems blew my mind. They also provided this kind of imagery that I could draw on. So, there was a lot of other folks that really influenced, the work I was doing and how I thought about this story.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to give folks a reminder that if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Williams, you can submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom there. We'll keep talking for a little bit. We've got some questions coming in, and we want to make sure to have some time for those questions too.
Yeah.
So let's see. I did have one more question here. So yeah, we talked about this being a long-term project, and you've talked about its resonance today. And you've been working on it for over 11 years, and a lot has happened to sort of increase focus and attention on systemic racism, continuing pervasiveness of white supremacist thought, police violence against Black people in this country. And I was curious what it was like to work on this. Excuse me, allergy season here in North Carolina.
Yeah.
What it was like to work on this over just the 11 years that we've had in the past decade plus.
Yeah, it's really something. I mean, I think about abolition, for example, and prison abolition. And, I started working in prisons in the mid 90s, very different time. In fact, the year I started working in prisons was the same year that, super predator was coined. And, these were the same boys that I was teaching in high school, that they were talking about, that white politicians were talking about. And at that point, it was not fashionable at all to talk about police brutality or to talk about prison abolition. really fringy kind of things. And I think that consciousness has shifted so dramatically. You know, I think about Rodney King, and I think about, how that for me was a real moment of consciousness, and really, I would say from really when Black Lives Matter began, I would say, in the 2013, 2014, 2015, I really began to see folks, I hate the term waking up, but kind of realizing what was happening. And for me, it was really interesting because for a lot of people, they thought, wow, I can't believe this is happening now. This kind of stuff we've never looked like this. Our country's never had these kinds of things. And I, working on this piece, I was like, this is everything all over again. And even what happened in 1898, so similar, so many parallels, the thing that is hard about this is our country keeps repeating the same stories over and over. And I mean, that's why I think historians are crucial to social justice and to social change. If people were able to have access to that kind of education, where history was a primary part of what they learned, and I think history teachers, especially in the K through 12 schools, do amazing work.
I found this on the web.
I don't know who that is, but anyway, it's my Siri, sorry. I think that that could change everything, So for me, working on that during that time was, I kept thinking, wow, I should publish this book now. I got to get this finished, and then another thing would happen and another thing would happen. And sadly, I was sort of like, there's always, these things are going to continue to happen. And, it's pretty heartbreaking, but I am so encouraged to see people beginning to truly imagine what it would look like if public safety was reconceptualized, if policing, was really abolished or changed, if people thought, what are other options to calling police? Do I have to call the police? Can I call someone else? So that's heartening, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say, as a reader, it would go back and forth between being, the book sets a great context. You get that historical continuity in the sense like, okay, folks have dealt with this in the past. We made some small progress, but then also just like utter horror that we haven't made more progress. And
yeah,
of course, that, yeah. Familiar. Well, excellent. So we have a couple of questions that have come in from folks. We can jump to those. We have from someone asking, what's next for you? What projects do you have on the horizon and are you excited about?
Yeah, I'm so lucky. I'm a big fan of David Saselski has this great blog where he goes to archives and finds stories. And he posted this story about a young Black man who was maybe 14 when the story begins. And he grew up in Eastern North Carolina, enslaved. And it's an account he gives to a newspaper in Maine. I'm not sure, I can't remember now how old he is when he gives this account of running through the Dismal Swamp to escape slavery. And, he ends up with Union troops and then eventually settles in Maine. And that story was appealing to me, one, because I grew up very close to the Dismal Swamp. I love the Dismal Swamp. And his story, the imagery in his story is really about the swamp. Like he's really afraid of snakes and he talks about the dark. And I'm thinking, you have, white men on horses with dogs after you. You are 14 years old. You are in the Dismal Swamp of all places, which is a huge and vast tract of land. And these are the things you're interested in. And so, and his account is incredible. It's like reading poetry. And I also lived in Maine as a kid. So I was like, I'm so familiar with these landscapes. So I'm working on a really richly illustrated version of his account. It sort of looks like a really fancy children's book, but it's not at all. The story is not at all really for children. And so I'm also doing this sort of counter narrative using the WPA stories that writers took from enslaved people, and writing this sort of counter narrative to what he's writing. He says, because he gave his story, I believe, to a white journalist, and so he still had to be quite guarded in how he described these things. So that's the piece I'm sort of working on right now, and really sort of excited about it. I'm about halfway through. So
wow, that sounds amazing. Do you foresee it being like a graphic scholarship work similar to Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed?
It's so funny. I just feel like I have to do these things, and I don't have good long-term thinking about who's going to publish this or what's it going to look like, and I think that's where working with incredible editors, I really changes things. So I think it's going to be a really, I'm doing these really rich, full color watercolor illustrations. And so I'd like for it to be a fairly, large book, and it won't be very long. So, but it's not really a graphic novel per se. It's really an illustrated story. So it's sequential, but it's not sequential in the same way that comics are necessarily.
Sure. Yeah. Well, good luck with that project. It sounds it sounds amazing. I have another question here. Have you presented this book in Detroit or in the community where the uprising took place? And what was the feedback like?
I am so excited. The Detroit Public Library reached out to me and asked me if I would be willing to do a public reading. And so I'm very excited to do that in June. I have, I've taken students to Detroit. I've done a lot of, I've visited Detroit. I have corresponded with scholars who write about Detroit, but I will be very excited to present this at the Detroit Public Library. And I'm hoping that folks come who have family who might remember, what happened in 1943. I mean, folks are right long in the tooth at this point if they were, involved in this in 1943. But I'm quite hopeful that I may get some folks who had grandparents who remembered this.
Wow, yeah, that should be really interesting. Remind folks that you can pop questions into the Q&A box if you have anything that you'd like to ask Dr. Williams. Is there anything that we didn't talk about, Rachel, that you had some slides that I think we skipped over, so I don't want to miss anything?
No, most of them were some of the sources. I just wanted to share with people how rich the archive was, and really all the things that were inspiring, and really to encourage people to go and do archival work. It's just the best work, really fabulous. The other thing I would say is that you can go to UNC Press and buy the book. I think you get a certain percentage off if you use the coupon. I think you all are going to talk about that at the end of the talk today. And UNC Press has incredible books, so hopefully you'll buy more than just my book.
Yeah, we'll remind folks about the discount for attending today. And we do have another question here asking what the blog was that you mentioned about archive stories.
Oh, David Soselsky's blog. If you I should have put a link to it. I don't want to do that right now. Googling is terrible to do on Zoom, but if you look up his work, he goes all over the place. And he also is a huge historian that knows a great deal about the 1898 coup in Wilmington. So David S. Soselsky, and he and Tim Tyson have co-authored a book about that, but he's a historian and does amazing archival work and tells fabulous stories. And his blog is really, every time he has a new post, it blows my mind, because he talks about, fishing and boats and living on the coast and, farming and just all kinds of things sort of really related to history. And he goes to different archives all over the coast. It's really interesting.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions coming through here, I can give folks a reminder about, we can wrap up. I was curious about your sense of place slide there. Since we do have a minute, that was one that I wanted to know what your...
Yeah, absolutely. I spent many, many hours driving around Detroit and Belle Isle. This slide is Belle Isle is a beautiful and amazing place. There's lots of amazing places to go in Detroit, but also, just trying to find these neighborhoods. One of the most poignant moments for me was finding that 8 Mile Wall, which is this, real relic of redlining. And the physical geography of that space just lays out the ways that racism worked to limit people's access to privilege and to power and to capital power. So yeah, I mean, that for me was really important, is to create a sense of place in Detroit. One of the folks that really contributed to that too was the work of Emily Kudel, who's an architect, and she has really found and brought to life these portraits of the architecture of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom in Detroit, which were Black neighborhoods. And that archive also was incredible, because many of those places were basically razed, when they did highway construction and changed the city. But yeah, that sense of place for me was really important. So I'm hoping people that lived and worked in Detroit get a sense of Detroit. One of the things for me that was really hard is drawing cars. I have never been good at drawing cars. I struggled with it. It was so hard, but I was like, it's so important for Detroit. And when people look at this, I'm hoping that they'll be like, oh yeah, I know what kind of car that is. So
I certainly didn't notice anything off about the cars. Not a car person myself, but it all blended together really wonderfully. And yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for taking time to talk with us and to share your work. And as we wrap up here, I would also like to express my appreciation to my university libraries and UNC Press colleagues, especially Katie Fanfani, Maria Estorino, Nadia Clifton, and Ali Shea for everything that they do to make the Off the Shelf series happen. Thank you to all of you who joined us in the audience today. Thank you very much. And don't forget that you can visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy a copy of this fantastic book. I've got a note here that the discount code, if you don't have it handy, is 01DAH40. It's like 01DAH40. And I'd also like to remind you that the Off the Shelf series continues next month with our final presentation for spring 2021. Please join us on Thursday, May 27th at noon, when Dr. Finis Dunaway will present Defending the Arctic Refuge, a photographer, an indigenous nation, and a fight for environmental justice. So thank you again so much, Rachel. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you, everybody.
thank you. This has been great.